you for being here today. I'm Gaëlle Despierre Corporon, and I will present an article entitled South-South Cooperation and Dynamic Long-Term Development Financing, Post-GFC, Post-Global Financial Crisis, and COVID Perspectives. And I want to also thank the Association for Evolutionary Economics to let me present today. So first, I would like to briefly recall the context of development finance. The analysis is situated in the context of instability of the capitalist system, which is reflected by multiple crises. For example, the Latin American crisis in the 70s, the Asian crisis in the 90s. And this confirmed the failure of liberal responses to a crisis. I briefly recall three main characteristics of this crisis and the adopted responses. First, the creation and implementation of the Washington Consensus and the structural adjustment programs. Second, the instrumentalization of the role of institutions by international financial institutions, IFEs, and neo-institutionalists. And third, the reduction of development to a simple quantitative aspect, which is the increase of GDP. So these two crises, plus the COVID crisis, mark a milestone toward the willingness to achieve a new model of cooperation based on regional integration and more generally on South-South cooperation. So the United Nations in 2016 estimates that South-South cooperation, which includes official concessional loans, grants, as well as debt relief, and technical cooperation, it has increased from 7 billion in 2006, to 20 billion in 2030. So in recent years, two South-South cooperation trends emerged. First, the scaling up of Southern-led liquidity funds. And second, the establishment of new Southern-led large multilateral and regional development banks. Krieg and Gallagher in 2019 have attempted to quantify these recent trends in South-South cooperation, and they found that a decade after the GFC, the amount of available liquidity support in the economy increased from 5 trillion to more than 12 trillion, and that developing countries, DCs, they hold about around 63% of this total. To visually represent the shift in the gravity of the development finance to the south, I can also refer to this figure of Baroclough and Gottschalk in 2018. So we see the shift from banks with a global reach that are owned by the North, it's the top left corner, such as the European Investment Bank or the World Bank, to banks with regional reach, but that are owned by the South. It's the bottom right corner, such as the development banks of Latin America, the African Development Bank, or the Inter-American Development Bank, and the Asian Development Bank. We can also notice in the top right corner that we have global and Southern owned banks, such as the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the Islamic Development Bank, that are gaining power. So what are the objectives of this article? There are two objectives. First, to point to a possible shift from the development financing architecture towards development financing that would focus more on the interest and needs of developing countries. And the second objective is to prove that the GFC and the COVID crisis induced major institutional changes. So my work is based on two statements. First, the GFC induced productive incoherence because the GFC generated irrelevant responses, but also stimulated further questioning on the global financial system and development aid policies. So the recurrent financial crisis and the COVID crisis paved the way for new perspectives of development financing. And the second statement is that DCs are dependent on traditional cooperation and not resilient to market-based and pro-cyclical financial flows. So this article has three main results. First, that is to say, South-South cooperation cannot yet substitute North-South traditional cooperation because South-South cooperation tends to reproduce the same inequalities as traditional North-South cooperation. The second result is that to ensure that the principles of South-South cooperation are respected, a dynamic institutional framework is notably necessary. New perspective for the long-term development financing would contribute to lower the instability of the financial system and the rigidity of its existing institutions. And finally, third result, new Southern-led multilateral regional development banks have a growing role, such as the new development bank, also called the BRICS Bank, created in 2014. So the contribution of this article is to propose for a long-term development financing the creation of a global supranational institution that we could call global development banks. The main objectives of this global development bank would be to collect and distribute funds to developing countries on the principle of mutual aid. According to this principle, actors are pushed to overcome the individualistic and competitive behaviors that drive development financing. So the adoption of more ethical behavior is desired from a long-term development financing perspective. The second objective of this bank would be to create a new platform for the South to communicate and be better represented. And the third objective would be to promote knowledge sharing through regional integration and common experience that helps DCs, developing countries, to diversify and reinforce their domestic economies in an ecological and sustainable way. So this bank has some main characteristics and mechanisms. It would act as a multi-currency global reserve system, having a counter-cyclical effect in case of external shock. The members of the bank would agree on common collective targets that realizes equality and mutual benefits. Another rule would be to have one nation, one vote as a supervisory mechanism to guarantee that all projects that are collectively decided must not favor any member and must provide a fair distribution of funds between members. It would not impose conditionality, IMF-like, and provides an incentive mechanism for reimbursement decided among all members. Also, the bank would favor the engagement and participation of individual countries and especially support smaller and weaker partners. Finally, the bank is dynamic to remedy the rigidity of supranational existing institutions. It would be flexible and evolves according to the interactions among members. To conclude, I will say that the amount of South-South cooperation is growing. It went from, it was 20 billion in 2013. But if we look at the traditional official development assistance, the traditional North-South aid, it was 135 billions in 2013. So it's not so much the amount that matters, but the development opportunities that present themselves to the South that matter. South-South cooperation initiatives after the GFC and the Latin American crisis and the Asian crisis before it, they show a willingness to move away from the international financial institution prescriptions and traditional cooperation system. Nevertheless, these initiatives, whose stated principles are equity, mutual benefits, etc., they are well thought, but they often reproduce the same mistakes as the traditional North-South cooperation. So the most salient perspective for long-term development financing presented in this article is the use of a global supranational institution in charge of development financing that we call in this article Global Development Bank. The aims of this institution could be mainly to collect and distribute funds to developing countries. And the main difference with the existing development banks is the worldwide coverage and the governance rules. So this is the actual table I included in the article, which you cannot probably read right now. It is possible to send me an email to have the complete article and details about this. My email is written here, and thank you for your attention and the virtual session today.
Thank you very much, Gaëlle, for your very nice presentation. So now I let Annesha and Satyaki to present their papers.
Yes.
About sexual harassment, please, Annesha.
Yes, thank you. I'll just start sharing my slides.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. So hope the slide is visible and I'm audible as well. So good morning or good afternoon to everyone. Satyaki and I will be presenting our paper, which is on sexism and sexual harassment in higher educational institutions in India. So education for women is often considered as a crucial factor and a force to reduce gender inequality. And when we look at the Indian context, we find that the percentage of women in the 19 to 25 years of age holding at least a graduate degree has in fact increased over time. So it was 4.38% in 91 and it became 11.41% in 2011. Albeit it is low, it has increased. But these mere figures, although they might be encouraging to some extent, they do not tell us about the kind of experiences that women have to go through to attain these educational degrees in the first place. Because there are scholars like Alaka Basu and Whiteley and Page who have shown and they argue that educational institutions, they nurture an environment where there is this pervasiveness of patriarchal ideologies and sexual harassment prevails. And this pervasiveness of sexual harassment impacts women in a number of ways. It limits their opportunities, it brings about a loss of their confidence, and it also creates a loss of access to informal channels of information. So this acts as a motivation for our study where we look at such incidences in the Indian context. And when we come to the Indian context, when we talk about the Indian context, there are quite a few studies, but then it's pretty limited. Most of them are field surveys, and which is understandable. but we also require a macro picture of this situation. So our study contributes to this literature where we bring to light various experiences of sexist practices and instances of sexual harassment faced by female students. And we also try to look into institutional interventions to address these issues. So to this end, we conducted a survey, and we also try to represent our empirical observations in a game theoretic model. And when we talk about sexism or sexual harassment, we are basically following Fitzgerald and Schulman's definition of sexist behavior. That is, it ranges from gender harassment to sexual assault. Coming to the data sources and methodology, we conducted this survey via Google Forms, and we opted for a snowball sampling. And in order to ensure the respondents that anonymity will be maintained, neither their names nor their email addresses were collected. And these forms they were circulated among women who have studied in some college or university, public private institution, like at some point of time. And within the questionnaire, we have tried to include subtle forms of sexism, wherein there is gender stereotyping by male students, male faculty members, or cracking sexist jokes and the like. Then we have also tried to incorporate explicit forms of sexism that include touching inappropriately or staring inappropriately or slut shaming, etc. And the survey also included questions of sexual harassment by various members of the institutions, like male students and male faculty members, or even the staff members, and whether the survivors filed an official complaint, and if not, then why. So overall, we received a total of 578 responses, both from students who are currently studying in some college or university right now, or former female students. And as I've mentioned, we have represented our empirical observations in the form of a sequential decision tree model in order to understand the working of the power dynamics that takes place in institutions, the cost associated with sexual harassment, and institutional intervention. And we will come to the theoretical model later on. First, let us look at the empirical observations. So over here, we find that around 76.8% of the total respondents have reported facing subtle sexism from male students, and the figure is 40.14% when it comes to male faculty members. When it comes to explicit sexism, around 69.03% of the total respondents have said that they have encountered such instances, and from male students and from male faculty, it is around 48%. But very surprisingly or very disconcertingly, around 46% of all of these respondents, they never consider their campuses to be unsafe. And this observation is very akin to that made by Barrack et al., who find that respondents did not perceive themselves to be harassed even though they were sexually harassed. So this underscores the normalization of sexism and sexual harassment even in campus spaces, which is supposed to be inclusive and safe for all of its stakeholders. So further analysis will be based on the respondents who reported facing subtle and explicit forms of sexism in their institutions. But first, let us look at certain sexist practices, which is one very common sexist practice is women being asked to dress appropriately. So 44% of the total respondents, that is 578 respondents, they have reported being asked to dress appropriately. And in this figure, we find that around 66.2% of these respondents, they have said they have been asked to dress appropriately by female faculty members. So this highlights the workings of internalized patriarchy, where women themselves indulge in sexist remarks. Now, going over to subtle sexism by male students, subtle sexism is manifested by unequal behavior towards women, but these are largely overlooked as they are often perceived as normal. And we've already showed it in the table that around 77% of the total respondents reported having faced such instances. Now, what are the different kinds of instances? The most commonly reported instance is that of cracking sexist jokes. That is around 78.6% of these 77% of the respondents, they have reported that it's very common for male students to crack sexist jokes. Next comes gender stereotyping, and then there is attributing their academic performances to their looks or their so to their looks. And then another thing which is very commonly observed is that commonly encountered by women is that of mansplaining. And then there are other types of subtle sexism as well. Now, going over to subtle sexism faced by male faculty, faced from male faculty members. So we find that 39.6% of the total respondents reported instances of subtle sexism practiced by male faculty members. And over here, we find that the most common instance again is that of gender stereotyping, and the next is ignoring their academic ideas on account of their gender. And then there are also other instances that have been cited by the respondents as well. Now, through these seemingly harmless practices, and they are very normalized because they are apparently very harmless, but this always work in a way such that the men are able to maintain their dominance over women, and that perpetuates the patriarchal stereotypes, keeping the man always at a superior position in the society. And this also creates a lack of general respect towards female students within the campus spaces, which can in turn prevent them from reaching their full potential. Now, coming to explicit sexism faced from male students, we noted that around 68.9% of the total respondents faced some form of explicit sexism from the male students. And over here, we have the types of explicit sexism that have been encountered from male students. So the most common is staring inappropriately, where like 78.7% have reported having encountered this instance or this experience. Then we have catcalling, which is very high. Then insisting on communicating with them against their own will. Then we have slut shaming or unsolicited calls or texts, and insisting on reciprocating to their romantic gestures against the woman's will. So Abby notes in their survey that males perceive female friendliness as seduction. So this can explain the pervasiveness of incidents like sending unsolicited phone calls or texts, insistence of reciprocating romantic gestures, sending unsolicited gifts, etc. Now, moving over to explicit sexism by the male faculty members, we noted that around 40% of the respondents, they have reported having faced such instances. And when we look into the types of explicit sexism faced from male faculty members, again, we find that staring inappropriately is the most common instance, with 78% reporting this particular experience. And then we have complimenting their looks and dresses, which may be harmless or which might make a student feel uncomfortable. So, and then expressing non-academic concerns in the female students' lives, etc. And then we have inviting them alone to their homes, or touching inappropriately, or discussing about his own personal romantic relationships, which like each of these instances, they always have this credible threat where the female student might be uncomfortable. So what is important to note here is that there is this power difference accorded by both the academic setup and the patriarchal society, which makes it difficult for female students to decline uncomfortable invitations and gestures. So when there are these instances that come from the male professors, then they have this twofold hierarchical position, which comes from the social position, because they are accorded a higher status in the society, and also from the academic setup, because they are professors, and that always enables them to put forth credible threats to the female students. Even if the student is uncomfortable with any of these instances, she may not be able to say they may not be able to say it. So they are very susceptible to abuses of such institutional and social power. Finally, we have sexual harassment in campus spaces. We find that 57 of the total 578 respondents have reported being sexually harassed or assaulted by at least one person from their respective educational institutions. And in this diagram, we see that 87% of these 57 respondents, they have reported that students of the same institution, they have sexually assaulted them. And following the sexual harassment of women at workplace in India of 2013, the Internal Complaint Committee was set up in academic institutions to address these issues of sexual harassment and assault. So, of these students, only 15.7% of the survivors lodged a first information report with the police or filed a complaint with the ICC, in spite of around 57% of them reporting the presence of an ICC in their institution. And when they were asked in the form why they did not file any official complaint, they said that 56.14% said that they feared character assassination, 36.84% feared backlash from their institutions, and 33.3% reported the absence of ICC or relevant committee in their institutions in the first place. So we find that there is this entire failure of institutions to inculcate a safe environment, and then there is this prevalent culture of victim blaming that precludes women from lodging an official complaint so that proper steps can be taken. And we also need to acknowledge the prevalent power hierarchy that is skewed against female students, particularly in cases where a male faculty member is the perpetrator. I'll stop here now, and Shatavi will take it on from here.
I hope my screen is visible and I'm audible to all of you. Thank you, Annesha. I'll continue from, I'll take up the theoretical aspect of our work. So in this section, we have tried to develop the dynamic game theoretic model to understand the intervention of institutions and to underline what contexts would be necessary for institutions to take the relevant steps in order to prevent the incidences of sexual harassment. We have formed a simple decision tree of a game with 3 players. There is a man, the woman, and the institution. The greater power that males have over females due to patriarchy has been incorporated in this game as well by making the male student, the man, as the first mover in this sequential game. So this is the decision tree where the man is the first mover. The man has 2 possible strategies, either to harass with probability P or not harass with probability 1 minus P. If the man does not harass, then the game ends with everybody having their initial payoffs as M star, W star, and I star. If the man does harass, then woman consequently has 2 strategies, either to lodge a complaint with probability Q or not lodge a complaint with probability 1 minus Q. If the woman does not lodge a complaint, again, the game ends. When the man gets an extra payoff of M1, we can denote M1 as the cultural variable, that the payoff that the man gets by imposing his authority over the woman. W1 would be the cost that the woman faces on surviving a harassment, and the institution still has the initial payoff of I star itself. Institution in turn can take an action or not take an action with probability alpha and 1 minus alpha. If the institution takes action against the perpetrator, then the man ends up with a payoff of M star plus M1 minus B, where B is the cost that the man has to face because of the punishment inflicted on him. J would be the pay.
Just your time is over, Satyaki. Maybe you can conclude in a quick way, please.
Yes, sure. Okay, so these are the broad conclusions. We have found out the expected payoffs of the man and the woman, and consequently the conditions that would be necessary for the institution to take an action. The final result of this game can be understood by the fact that the only way to disincentivize the behavior of the man would be to inflict a punishment which is high enough to disincentivize sexual harassment. So this is the implication of our theoretical model, which states that not only institutional intervention would be necessary for addressing sexual harassment, but also there is an aspect of also there is an aspect of shift in gender inequalities, which would be instrumental in preventing sexual harassment. Both these implications of the feminist theory and the institutional theory follow from our game theoretical result. So there are limitations in the collection of data, but I think that can be addressed in the face of maintaining anonymity of the respondents. Thank you. I can go through the theoretical model if anybody is interested, but in the interest of time, I'll stop right now.
Thank you very much, Satyaki. So I let now the floor to Jairo about rhinestones and banknotes. Jairo, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen. So you have to allow me to share my screen.
Okay. Normally you should have the authorization because I have not. Catherine, maybe can you give the hand to Jairo?
Hi, sorry, what was it?
To share the screen. Yeah, normally you can share.
Who is looking? Annesha?
Jairo.
Yeah, you need to allow me to share the screen.
Okay, give me one moment here.
Well, meanwhile,
You should have full capabilities.
all right.
Now.
All right. Okay. I hope you are seeing the presentation. This is a paper I've been working on several years ago. And the idea behind this paper is to, as always I've done, is to apply the original institutional economics to a specific country or region, and to see all these concepts in force, in motion. So my main question here is, why is the case that if in Colombia we have a peace process that started 4 years ago in 2012 and finished in 2016 with the main guerrilla group, why is the case that there was so much rejection of this peace process in our country? And in order to analyze this, I use the John Foster principle for institutional adjustment, which I think is a very, very proactive line of thought to analyze this kind of problem. And what I found is that there is a very huge persistence of the institutional matrix of my country's elites that show how difficult is to face these changes, even though the changes that were proposed were very moderate. And after 6 years of the agreement was signed in 2012, and I think that an evaluation of this process is very helpful. Let's tell you a little bit about Colombia. Maybe you don't know much about this. Colombia is a country with 50 million inhabitants, with a GDP of $6,325 and a life expectancy of 75 years. It's like a middle level development country. It's not very poor, but still we have problems. For example, in 2017, we have almost 30% of households were considered poor, and with the pandemic, this went very bad to 40%. The monetary poverty is 26.9. The multidimensional poverty is 17.8, and the extreme poverty is 7.4. The country has had social progress, in health and education since the 1950s. But there is an armed conflict that started in 1964 that, in my opinion, and many people who has analyzed this issue, has hindered the economic growth. Colombia is a very peculiar country in Latin America. Is the only one remaining country that still have guerrillas on the territory. So in order to analyze this, I use all this theory of institutional adjustment that you can read in Foster, 1981, Atkinson, Mark II, and this theory has three principles. In order to achieve an institutional adjustment, you need to comply these three principles. Of the first one is the principle of technological determination. The second one is the principle of recognizing interdependency, and third, the principle of minimal dislocation. In a book I wrote based on my dissertation, I show that in Colombia, since the Spanish colonization, all these three principles have been violated. I show that in this book that was published. My dissertation was published in Colombia in Spanish, even though Colombia has had a process of modernization, especially the second condition and the third condition have not been fulfilled. So when the peace process emerged in 2016, it was a new opportunity. Colombia is a very unequal country. Piketty, famous French economist, said that Colombia has one of the highest inequality in the world. This is a big word. And according to the Palmas Index, we can see that the Colombia's index is 3.9, even higher than Brazil. And take into account that Norway has 0.9. So that gives you an idea how unequal is this nation. And in these numbers, we can see how the Gini coefficient has diminished a little bit, but not much. It's one of the highest in Latin America. And the main element of the peace agreement was the following. The first one with the FARC guerrilla, 7,000 members in arms. The first one was integral rural reform. The second one was political participation. And the third one was the end of the armed struggle. The fourth point was the solution to the problem of illegal drugs. The next point was taking care of the victims. The main consideration of this agreement was resting on the victims. And the last point was the implementation, verification, and endorsement. So this happened 6 years ago. What happened in the Colombian conflict? From 1980 to 2010, 225,000 persons were killed. 7 million persons were affected by this conflict. 6.5 million were displaced internally. So Colombia has a record displacing people within the country. And all the analysis show that the GDP growth per year was affected by 1.5%. But curiously, when the government achieved this agreement, he presented this agreement to the population through a plebiscite. And this plebiscite only got 37 points of participation, and 49.7 we said yes, and 50.2 said no. So they considered that the agreement was not enough. So the right-wing parties criticized and used fake propaganda, and as we can see now in the US with the Trumpists and all these things, to convince people that the agreement will lead Colombia to a Venezuelan situation. This is still going even now that we are going to have presidential election this year. And they criticize the special justice system created by the agreement. when you look at the country, which region voted no, this is the red one, precisely the most conservative regions, and the green one voted yes. And so the government was trapped in this. The government never thought that it was going to lose this plebiscite, and then they tried to validate using the Congress, but after that, there was a big political divide regarding this issue. So it created a path-dependent process of polarization that still goes on. So what happened with the agreement? It was a timid attempt to diminish rural inequality. It didn't mean a deep structural reform. The agreement implies an investment of $31,000 million through 10 years, which is affordable. And it implies government expenditure in health, education, roads, water supply, institutional development, local governments, rural development of the region that suffered the war. And these are the regions that were selected for its development planning special zones. And the balance of this agreement was the following. FARC, who was the main guerrilla, surrendered 8,000, more than 900 weapons, and they transformed itself in a political party that went to election recently. The outcome for them was very poor. They got only 5 seats in the Senate, thanks to the agreement, not because of the votes, because based on the vote, they wouldn't get anything. And the government issued many laws informing the peace process, liberated prisoners, but the process is in reality, according to all analysis, only in 20%. From that date, 1,270 social and human rights leaders have been murdered and 3 members of FARC have been killed. So can you imagine that? In Colombia, every day, any 1 or 2 social leaders are killed. It's amazing. The rural legislation for some land reform is still pending. The political reform has not been approved. The special jurisdiction for victims, allowing them to reach Congress, finally was approved, ordered by Constitutional Court. And the resistance to these minimal reforms is huge. Even though that's true, the process has been positive. We have a decline in homicide rates. The displaced people have been diminishing. And a balance made by the Kroc Institute show that the problems in the rural reform are huge, especially in political participation, but the only issue where the government got us upset was in implementation and verification. So what you can see is that the elite accepted this process just to disarm these guerrillas, and the social and political conditions that the agreement implies have not been enforced. And according to Foster, he said, the second condition, institutional change that Foster established, has not been fulfilled, and the resistance to minimal reform are very strong. Social movements in Colombia are very weak and are mediatized by clientelist political parties. In some, years of war and FARC's war activities like attack a town, kidnapping, ransom, recruitment of children move people to a very conservative political profile. And power elites in Colombia are very jealous of their privileges and not willing to allow deep reform. I mean, when you are working in university in Colombia and you are a very progressive professor, you could be targeted. So you have to be very careful. And the future of the peace process is also endangered by the activity of the new guerrillas like the ELN and other illegal armed groups oriented to drug trafficking and coca crops. So what happened with the peace? Yeah, I'm running out of time. Peace can be conceived in a minimal way as the absence of war, or from an elite standpoint, aiming just to disarm the open. But peace is not just state of the world or a situation, but a complex process to which society must undergo to improve the condition of the underlying population. As Counterback posits, this is not a linear process where the main objective preserving the physical integrity of the population, guaranteeing individual and collective rights amidst ethnic difference, and a constructive transformation or conflict should be the main target. And the problem in Colombia is that this is a very huge divided society, and there is no, the third principle of foster the recognized interdependence. So the process is opposed by powerful sector of the elite. It's incredible. This is kind of a schizophrenic condition because all the analysis show that the peace is very necessary. But when you go to the ground, to the territory, they don't, for example, the landowner, they don't want to hear about it in any form. So there is a extractive model based on controlling the land, present a powerful obstacle to implementing the first point of the agreement, despite his modesty. So the third condition is very difficult to achieve because the government has not enforced the political participation of the alternative parties. And the war still remains in many areas, fueled by monetary resources that come from drug trafficking and illegal trade. Yet, Colombian society must pursue the agreement, cementing future accords with political armed organizations, as we are convinced, following Clarence Ayer's words, social progress is inevitable despite all the obstacles we find on the road. All details of the paper you can read on the website and the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jairo, our FE 2022 James Street Scholar. Thank you very much. So I let the floor, the Rhinestone and Banknotes to Scott McConnell. Scott, please.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's see. Okay, thank you, everybody. I'll just begin by saying I teach at Eastern Oregon University. Eastern Oregon is in La Grande, Oregon, which has a interesting relationship, institutional relationship with Micronesia. We have a lot of Micronesian students. And one of them, when I was giving my presentations on money and history of money, he mentioned that he was from Yap, which is in the home of the rye stone. So if you don't know what that is, hopefully I'll be able to explain that today. So I got thinking, and I actually visited Yap a couple years ago, and we started working together on this a little bit a few years back, and we decided we'd like to kind of create a combination of thinking about how rye stones maybe are applicable to modern banking. So this paper is definitely a little bit outside of the norm of development, but I am interested in researching the development of this region as well. And so when we're talking about Yap, this is where it is. Just have a little picture here that kind of shows us where we're talking about. It's a very, very small island in the middle of the Pacific, and it's a little hairy flying in there if you haven't been to Micronesia. Landing on one of those islands is always a little bit interesting. So the island is broken up into some municipalities, which are going to come back to play as far as kind of the point of this paper. And the municipalities are listed here: Ramung, Bap, Gaëlle, Tamil, Fenif, Valoy, Delapano, Raoul is how that's pronounced, Canafe, and Gilman. When I visited, I stayed in the Tamil Gaëlle district of city of Colonia. And I interviewed a number of people there, including some of the senators from the Tamil Gaëlle region. So this paper is really kind of going to play off of some of my dissertation research, and as it's very famous out there now as far as modern money theory. But of course, some of that research begins with a discussion of medalist versus chartalist money. And so I begin there and kind of ask where the rhinestone, again, I'll discuss what the rhinestone is here in a second, but where the rhinestone fits in our conception of money, either medalist or chartalist, or maybe it's something completely different. And of course, future research, which I won't discuss today just because of shortness of time, we're going to be looking at how the RAI compares to cryptocurrency, NFTs, non-fungible transfers, and really digital central banking and digital fiat currency, because we have fiat currency today, but of course, as we're all aware, most currency is actually just digits on a computer screen at this point, scorekeeping, as you'd say. Okay, and so the two competing views in the history of the nature of money, this is coming from Karl Menger, Klein and Selgin, is that there are the medalists and the chartalists. The medalists, of course, is the view of money that we get in most of our textbooks, theorize that money has arisen as a natural evolutionary instrument in order to reduce transactions costs. This assumes, of course, that markets existed prior to the introduction of money. Since money is a transactions cost reducing mechanism, it must be agreed upon ultimately by the community. The thing that is chosen as money must have some intrinsic quality that gives it value. The medalist theory depends crucially upon this feature of money, this intrinsic quality idea. So according to this story, the community settles on a precious metal, such as gold and silver, to act as money due to their advantageous characteristics, such as durability, divisibility, and portability, in reducing the transactions cost of previous barter arrangements. The medalist position accepts the primacy of the intrinsic value of the precious metal contained in the money. For example, if the money is represented by a gold coin, then it is weighted gold embodied in the coin that gives the money its value. This comes from Charles Goodhart and Randall Wray. Okay, and so that's the medalist position. Opposing this position is the chartalist position. Many of us have heard this, so I'll go somewhat quickly, but the chartalist view is that there is, it basically gets the name, or its name, from the word chartal, which means ticket or token. Money is seen by chartalists as a token representing an IOU from a creditor to a debtor. Money is inherently a social relationship entered into by creditors and debtors, including the state, from A. Mitchell Innes, 1913. A most important aspect of this chartalist position is that the ultimate, most liquid form of money is tied to the authority of a nation state. It does not rely on the institutional evolution toward a single unit of account with intrinsic value, but rather by the power held by the nation state to determine what is and will not serve as currency. The government declares this money thing to be money. By deeming a particular money thing as money is not enough. The state must also declare that the money thing will be acceptable at all government pay offices for payments made to the state, and of course, taxes being the primary way in which we make payments to the state. And this is how it becomes state money. So to the rhinestone then, what is rhinestone? Well, the famous rhinestone money, which maybe we've seen in our textbooks, is actually created out of limestone that is quarried 400 miles away from Yap on Palau. And so this stone does not exist on Yap. It is actually created on Palau, and it is shipped. It is created into the shape that you see here, these large stone discs, and these are very large. Some of them are very small, but some of them can be up to 1.5 stories or so in size, very, very large. And this was, the original rye was originally instituted around 1000 to 1400 CE. And again, it was, these were taken 400 miles across the ocean, and the rye was quarried by enslaved Palauans, so on the island of Palau, by a Yapese man named Anagumang, The Yapese had power, and you might be asking, how did this group of people have such power over the Palauans? But they actually at this point had power over other islands because they professed that they had power over the storms. And my guide told me that this was due to the fact that they basically said a typhoon was going to come, and it did, and they were correct that one time, and from then on they had power for many years. So many of the other islands just kind of did what they said. So anyway, the Rye Stone was part of this story. Later on, an Irish explorer, and this is in the 1800s, an Irish explorer named James O'Keefe brought his huge schooner to move many. He ended up in Yap, and he ended up becoming a resident of Yap for a very long time. A lot of things are named O'Keefe this and O'Keefe that there, actually. But he used his large boat. He said, "Oh, you like these stones? Great. I'll just go ahead and get a bunch of these." And so he went over to Palau, and he loaded up his vessel, and he was able to bring many, and he made many trips, and he brought many of the Rye stones. And so he became very popular because he was able to bring all of these Rye stones. So he was basically able to get all the money. What's interesting about this, though, there's a picture of me about some Rye stones, is that the Rye stones are valued by their difficulty in acquisition, not their size. So each stone has its own history and is owned by a particular family. The stones brought by O'Keefe actually have less value to the Yapese than those that were brought by Longboat. So that's kind of an interesting fact, that if it wasn't very hard to get the stone, then it has less value. A little bit of a maybe labor theory of value thing there or something, or a danger theory of value. To what extent can we understand this Rye stone money through a discussion of Charlist and Medalist perspectives on money? Or do the Rye stones exist within their own specific cultural understanding of money and cannot be understood really in a modern money sense? So prior to the Rye stones, and actually coincident with the Rye stones, the island used what was called yar, or shell money. This was in place when the Remung municipality was dominant. So this is important. When the Tamil Gaëlle municipality earned dominance over the rest of the island, they instituted their preferred money, which is the Rye. So here we see actually that when the Remung municipality was dominant, they preferred the shell money. The Tamil Gaëlle municipality preferred the Rye, and the Rye was so this is kind of an important point in conclusion here, is that it lends a little bit of credence to the Charlist position. The particular money that was used at a point in time was not driven by technological transactions cost reduction, as would be predicted by a medalist understanding of money, but rather by hierarchical governmental decision making. As we understand it, the municipality in control of the islands determined what money would be used to store value and used to pay taxes. Now, the thing about the Rye is that it was very valuable. Each piece was incredibly valuable. So it didn't function very well as for small transactions. So the yar, the shell money, actually continued to be used even when the Rye was the dominant money. The Rye was the hierarchically dominant money. Almost you could think of it in a modern sense as high-powered money, and the shell money was almost like banknotes, right? And so the Rye does not fit perfectly into the Charlist perspective, as it wasn't the only money at any point. And then, of course, today they use US dollars because they have a compact with the United States. So small transactions never were used. Rye was never used for small transactions. So it's not necessary for Charlist money, but assume that the money would be, of course, used for transactions day to day, and it was not. So given that the Rye does not move, does hold value, and the ownership is exchanged between members of the community, the Rye does resemble greatly how value is transacted in modern central banking through the use of reserves and high-powered money. We don't actually physically move money, and those stones did not move once they were in place. Nobody's rolling those around the village or anything. It's just ownership was changed. So it's got me thinking about cryptocurrency and NFTs and all this stuff. And this is a future direction of this paper, is that the cryptocurrency using blockchain technology resembles the Rye in a lot of ways, and that each is relatively scarce, but both can be mined, much like gold, which is kind of a non-Charlist perspective on what Rye stone is. Now, unlike cryptocurrency, RAI differs in the sense that its use was enforced by the municipalities of Yap and used to pay taxes. So it is very much chartalist in that sense. So what am I leaving you with? I guess still a mystery, but we know a little bit more about the RAI stone. I am looking forward to this summer. Well, I'll be doing some more research only on a little bit of a different topic, but we'll be looking at the climate disruptions that the islands are going to be suffering and in the future, and any future adaptations, including immigration to the United States, and including the town in which I'm currently living here, La Grande, Oregon, with the networks that are in place. So that's my information. If anyone has any questions, of course, feel free to ask me or send me an email if you'd like. And that's the conclusion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Scott. So I let the floor to Ricardo now about between stability and liberty.
Okay, good afternoon. The article I would like to share with you in this section is between stability and liberty, the transformation of China and its controversial impact on the global South in times of crisis. And this is the outline of my article. Okay. In this study, I raised 4 research questions for examination. First, what are the primary difference between China and the West, which mainly refers to Western Europe and North America, and in their social and economic transformation? Second, how did the transformation of China bring about its changing impact on the global South in times of crisis? Third, what are the factors leading to the increasing controversies over China's impact on the global South in times of crisis? The last question is about, can China substantiate a net positive impact on the global South in times of crisis? To examine these research questions, I followed the historical approach and go through a narrative analysis with the evidence derived from 4 crises. And recently, some studies indicate that certain phenomena existed in the process of China's economic reform are similar to the great transformation in the 19th century Europe as portrayed by Polanyi. In particular, the social and economic instabilities as the result of the development of markets, commodification process of the resources, and the expansion of the old finance are underlined. Besides the speculative orgies in the self-regulating financial markets are also seen as explicited by Gaëlle as the root of the financial instability may also see evolving in China. Nevertheless, through a review of the major evidence in the last 4 decades, I argue that the transformation of China is fundamentally different from the West in 3 major aspects. First, the transformation of China does not go through a process of nationwide social and market liberalization. Second, it is largely driven by the public planning, which advanced the development of a regulate instead of a self-regulating economy. Third, it is the public choice to achieve a reasonable, although controversial, trade-off between stability and liberty in the society. Actually, these are unique contextual settings for China's transformation from the outset, provide a realistic grounds for us to uncover its ability to not only resolve the internal crisis, but also to cope with the threat from the external crisis. For example, although evidence show that the public planning from the outset is not perfect, and crises like the double movements, a large social crisis occurred in the 1989. The government's determination to embed economic development into the specific context of the Chinese society allowed it to live through various crises. And given the objective and public planning of economic reform, China's connection with the global South is dynamic, which changed from almost inactive before the middle of the 1990s to the rapid expansion in the 21st century. This is because to jumpstart the economic reform with the needed capital fund and talents, China had to first connect with the West rather than the global South. And following the initial success of the economic reform, China resumed its connection with the global South from the middle of the 1990s. In terms of sharing the economic reforms experience with those countries, as well as to increase the trade with them. Thus, China's involvement in the global South, from the trade of commodity to the loans for their economic development, are increasing over time. However, the impact of China's increasing involvement in the global South, including in times of crisis, are also getting more controversial. To portray the changing impact from the transformation of China on the global South in times of crisis, I examined the evidence from 4 crises, 2 from economics and 2 social. They are the Asian financial crisis in 1997, the global financial crisis in 2008, a viral respiratory disease called the SARS in 2003, and the existing COVID-19 crisis also. And analyzing from the economic standpoint, China's restriction on the liberal flow of financial capital did help it to contain any possible domino effects on the global South in the event that China is affected. For example, China's financial stability in the Asian financial crisis undoubtedly reduced the speculative orgies of the international speculators like the quantum group of funds, which further inhibited their predatory financial activities in the global South. Actually, the determination of Chinese government to trade off stability and liberty throughout the process of its economic reform in turn verified this argument that unregulated financial flow can contribute to disastrous boom and bust cycle in the developing countries and make their industrial policy impossible. Actually, this argument is illustrated and confirmed again through the experience learned from the global financial crisis. Despite the fact that higher liberty was approved to the financial market, capital flow was still highly monitored by the Chinese government. And thus, it is also argued that the China's ability to overcome the global financial crisis helped to cushion the impact of the global recession on some of the low-income economies by retaining the appropriate trades with them. However, the overall impact of China on this on the global South in this crisis is getting controversial. The particular controversy is that China may actually take the benefits from the global South in this crisis by obtaining their resources with lower market price. Thus, also in the times of social crisis, the Chinese government's ability to tighten liberty in the community on the ad hoc base allowed the countries to ensure its stability. For example, in the local crisis, the SARS in 2003, the governments took determined actions to lock down the cities being infected and enforce the mandatory quarantine policies for the infected individual and groups. These measures cut off the transmission chains of the virus in several months. And then this minimized the impact on the global South, as you can see some of the statistics here. As a response to the current COVID-19 pandemic on the global level, the Chinese government reverted to tighten the liberty of people's interaction in the society as a measure to ensure the social stability. Although this measure taken by the Chinese government are controversial, they do help to largely lower the spread of the virus. Accordingly, the under-controlled situation in the mainland enabled the Chinese government has supplied vaccines to the global south. For example, over 500 million doses of the vaccines were supplied to 34 global south countries in the first 4 months in the 2021. Nevertheless, owing to the critical international relationship between China and the West, China's impact on the global south in this pandemic is also getting more controversial. For example, the intentions of vaccine diplomacies and the threat of increasing debt burden to the global south are widely discussed. And to depict the changing impact of China on the global south in these 4 crises, I construct a simple diagrams to facilitate the understanding. And on the right-hand side of this diagram, it shows that by the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, the 2 crises were regional in the global south. To a larger extent, China succeeds to overcome and contain this crisis actually generate a stabilizing impact on the global south. Nevertheless, following China's increasing involvement in the international affairs, its impact on the global south is getting more controversial. As aforementioned and depicted on the left-hand side of this diagram, the indirect impact from China on the global south in the recent 2 crises are both positive and negative. Okay, now parallel to China's increasing involvement in the rest part of the global south, so as the concern about whether China may become a source of the future crisis, or it can retain the role to help stabilizing the crisis in the global south. In fact, the possible debt and social crisis in the global south draw most attention in the recent discussion. For example, it is observed that China's lending to African governments was snowballing from around 140 billions in the year 2000 to 153 billions in 2019. In addition, the arrangement of these debts are primarily bilateral as opposite to multilateral under the existing international practice like the Washington Consensus. Nevertheless, a closer look at the structure of these external debts and interest burden of the African government may convey a controversial message. For example, regarding to the external debts of the African government in 2017, 20% owned to China, 32% was attributed to the international private sector, which excludes China, and the rest, 48%, was to the international organizations like the World Bank and the IMF. And regarding the interest burdens on the debt, over 70% of the bilateral debts were to China, and those interest payments account for around 17 to 20% of the total interest payment. So that as a major lender to other global south countries, China's impact in the context of a future debt crisis in the global south is clearly controversial. Based on the debt, the data that I presented in the last slide, and the likelihood of the China's to trigger a debt crisis may be low. However, whether China would prompt or stabilize a crisis if a crisis was to be occurred, for example, owing to the private sector debt in those countries, may actually depends on the strategic movement of the Chinese government. Other than the concerns of the debt crisis, of course, the acceleration of the commodification process of the natural resource in the global south country for trade with the China has been lead to the anxieties about the double movement of the related government. So that this is may be hardly to be stabilized by the Chinese government as the internal matter of the country. And to conclude this study, I would like to underline 4 points. And first, the transformation of China and its public planning is to seek for a trade-off between stability and liberty are specific to the contextual setting and hence workable in China. Second, the trade-off did not only facilitate China to deal with its internal crisis and insulate the adverse impact from the external crisis, but also helped it to inhibit any possible domino effects on other global South countries in the event that China is being affected. However, the contextual difference between China and the other global South countries implies that its amiable relationship with the other countries may not necessarily secure those countries' internal stability in economic and social area. And finally, to sustain China's net positive impact on the global South, instrumental rather than ceremonial measures has to be further established. And according to the particular facts that I identified in this study, the instrumental measures that have to be further explored definitely include the environmental protection and the debt restructuring in times of crisis. So that, thank you. These are the highlights of my article. If you have any question, I'm more than happy to discuss later in this section or through emails. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I see that Faruk has a problem with his computer, so we will continue with the presentation, the last one of Howard and Isabella.
Okay, let me, I can share my screen once the other person stops sharing, I guess.
Ricardo, can you stop sharing, please?
Stop sharing.
Isabella, if you just hit share, it'll say that you'll kick the other person off.
Okay.
Hit share
Okay.
and then stop share. Okay, then sorry.
Oh, okay. So can you see my presentation now?
Yes, it works.
Okay, great. Okay. Oh my God, now my computer went black, which is not helpful. Sorry for this. Oh my God.
Is this a question of F5 or F6, depending on what you
I think I just present like this now. Somehow my computer acts weirdly with PowerPoint. Sorry for this. Okay, so everybody can see the presentation now. Yes. Okay. So as the last paper in this interesting series, Howard and I would like to present this paper, which is very much a work in progress. So we appreciate any comments or suggestions that you might have. The title of our paper is Neoclassical Economics and the Neoliberal Policy Paradigm in Africa and China, Contours, Contrasts, and Convergences. So it's well established in the literature that economic ideas and international organizations have mattered in the global neoliberal revolution in the 1980s in economic policy. So we can observe that the same kind of neoclassical theories and broadly the same institutions, particularly the World Bank and Western foundations, were involved in the remaking of the economic discipline around the world. However, this global mainstreaming, if you want so, of the economics profession did not result in a uniform adaptation of neoliberal policy priorities. So on the one hand, we have this global phenomenon of the mainstreaming of economics and the rise of neoliberalism. On the other hand, the impact of this mainstreaming of the discipline was very heterogeneous. So in this paper, we address this quote unquote puzzle and aim to identify factors that explain the different outcomes of this mainstreaming of economics and the role of international organizations in this context, specifically in Africa and China. So why is it interesting to compare Africa and China? So first of all, in both cases, the economics profession was remodeled on the American neoclassical example. So there lies the commonality. I should add that also in both cases, the World Bank and the Bretton Woods institutions were involved, and so were international foundations. But while Africa became the global experimenting ground for structural adjustment and experienced a lost decade in the 1980s, China was one of the first countries to consider shock therapy, which is basically the correlate of structural adjustment in the context of socialist transitions. But China escaped shock therapy and started a phase of unprecedented growth in history. So what we are trying to do in this paper is to basically explore how this difference comes about, even though the change in the economics discipline and the involvement of the World Bank was there in both cases. We do so by first looking at the roots of the neoliberal development policy paradigm. We then look at the World Bank and how it has functioned to operationalize neoliberalism globally. We then move to a consideration of power and subordination in the global economy as an important factor in trying to unpack this puzzle that we have identified. And then in the fifth step, I hand over to Howard, who will give us an overview of Africa and the making of adjustment there. And then I'll take over again and talk about the Chinese path to marketization. And finally, we will present a conclusion. Clearly, this is ambitious, and I will try to be as concise as I can be. So we know, of course, that neoclassical economics does not need to take a neoliberal form, but the strongest strand in neoclassical economics is neoliberal and is characterized by two key tenets, which is universally freely moving prices, which is meant to be enabled by private property. And this neoliberal version of neoclassical economics is particularly dominant in international policy circles, and I should probably add national policy circles as well. Neoliberal policies in the global south is often attributed to the Washington Consensus, whereas the origins of these policies are then dated to the Mexican debt crisis in 1982 and the attempt at the time of international finance to preserve their interests in this debt crisis. But in reality, as we argue in the paper, the neoliberal policy paradigm in the global south has a much broader and earlier origin. So policy conditionality goes back to the aftermath of the Second World War and became an orthodoxy in the 1950s. However, it took until the late 1970s that this conditionality started to merge with a neoliberal policy outlook. Changes in the World Bank led to such a merger of conditionality and neoliberal policy packages at a time when the global economics profession, and particularly the American and English economics professions, became moved to see state intervention as creating distortions and therefore as hampering rather than enabling growth. And this insight was then basically translated into the development context. Some of the key figures here, and we are obviously just naming a very small selection, is Balasa, Deepak, Lal, Bhagwati, many others. But it's also important to mention Anne Kruger's first World Bank report in 1983, which kind of marked a watershed moment in the history of the bank. Okay, the more specifically, the World Bank neoliberal revolution begins with the appointment of Ernie Stern as vice president, who was in charge of operations, which happened in July 1978. So in this context, then, we have seen a systematic promotion of a neoclassical challenge to development economics, the recruitment of economists such as Balassa, and also important political interventions such as Ernie Stern intervening to convince McNamara to move from a critique of developed countries for their trade barriers in a speech still in May 1979 towards promoting a new lending device of, quote, additional assistance to developing countries that undertake the needed structural adjustment for export promotion in line with their long-term comparative advantage. So a shift from basically blaming developed countries for their trade barriers to blaming developing countries for not pursuing policies that are aligned with their given comparative advantages. The US also shifted its own stance on multilateral development under the lead of Reagan's Treasury Secretary, Don Regan, who was a former Wall Street chairman of Merrill Lynch and a key architect of Reaganomics. So again, there's an important report that matters, and that is precisely in this early 1980s moment that is dated to February 1982, entitled United States Participation in the Multilateral Development Banks in the 1980s, which is meant to give guidance to the World Bank. This report encourages developing countries to participate more fully in an international system based on liberalized trade and private capital flows, so very much in line with what I just said. It also emphasized the need to reduce basic human needs types of projects and to remove what they were calling targetry, that is an objective focus of loans. And then crucially, to make structural adjustment programs to be the emphasis of any kind of conditionality. Okay, so this is the background history in terms of how within the World Bank we see this policy paradigm shifting. And in the next step of this presentation, I try to argue how power matters in the ways in which this shift in the policy paradigm has affected Africa and China. So power is an important consideration, important conceptual dimension here. So we can define power as the capacity or ability to direct or influence the behavior of others or the course of events. And following French and Raven, we identify 6 dimensions to power. That is bestowing rewards, exercising coercion, building legitimacy, referential power, and the power of expertise and informational power. And all these power dimensions are at play in the relationship between the bank and the respective developing countries. The key characteristics of the global financial architecture is, of course, the hierarchy of currencies, which helps to define the standing of an economy in the global order. This global currency hierarchy, we argue, corresponds to the position of a country in the global trade hierarchy and is in turn mediated by the degree of domestic economic sovereignty. So in other words, depending on how much domestic economic sovereignty you have, your position in the global trade or currency hierarchy matters more or matters less. Dependency then reduces the policy space and affects the ways in which foreign economic expertise operates in the domestic economic policy paradigm. And while African countries and China were largely confined to raw material exports and their currencies were subordinate in the late 1970s and early 80s, so in that regard, China and Africa were still sharing 2 key characteristics. China enjoyed much greater economic sovereignty than African countries, and I will later argue how this played out in the Chinese context, and I now hand over to Howard.
Thanks, Isabel, very much. If you could click the next PowerPoint, thanks. So let me give a very quick analysis of the African adjustment. There's often a lot of misleading notions that Africa somehow received some model which was determined elsewhere. But in fact, Africa was a huge focal point of experimentation for the development of structural adjustment and neoliberalism as an international global model. And it's something which I've written about in a 2008 book and something which I've gone back to kind of look at much more systematically since then. And the question really became, what was the nature of its global standing that created the asymmetries of power based upon these various dimensions to institutionalize structural adjustment? And so in essence, it's standing the global economy and international finance set up a situation where it fit into this broad theoretical framework and allowed for the exercise of power. And very quickly, let me give some very quick examples. So the opportunity basically to increase the power of expertise looking at the dimensions by the World Bank occurred when the African governors in the late 70s, early 80s requested a new study of the continent. And then they hired Elliot Berg here from the University of Michigan, the new Ernie Stern. They both were critics of development economics. They'd worked together because something I was at many years ago, the Center for Research and African Development, is where Berg got a lot of money when Stern was working for USAID. And he knew exactly, after interviews I did at the time, around 2005, 2006 here in Ann Arbor, was in fact indicated they knew each other. And Berg knew exactly the kind of report he wanted to come up with a neoliberal style analysis. Next slide. Isabella? Right, so that led then to the Accelerated Development of Sub-Saharan Africa, or the Berg Report, which tied the causes of weak industry with this bias against exports in Africa, the incentive systems created by these state-imposed distortions from trade, exchange rates, and price interventions. The next absolutely central report, and again, you've got this background stuff going on with the Treasury, which we already discussed in the around the 80s when Reagan comes into power and Reagan becomes the Secretary of Treasury. So in '84, you then get this new incredibly important report called Towards Sustained Development in Sub-Saharan Africa, coming off an opportunity because of a huge famine in Africa to say, well, what are we going to do to help Africa? This was an opportunity to further impose the structural adjustment neoliberal agenda on Africa. And it had a huge impact on operations, basically focused on the need to get prices right in agriculture via devaluations, deregulation of marketing, massive increase in the private sector, and local self-financing. Next. So the report basically heavily emphasized the need for technical knowledge. And the technical knowledge is incredibly important for them because if you're imposing a particular model, local people had to understand the theory behind the model and buy into it to some extent. They also set up what was an incredibly important thing, which was a cartel. And so they, in essence, put the entire donor community, multilateral and bilateral, behind a single consultative annual meetings chaired by the World Bank. So that gave them a huge amount of power financially, and the power then to be imposed through coercion, the elements of conditionality, which was really central. It also gave them the resources to provide the rewards. But legitimacy was a really important part of the dimensions of power. And they understood they had this real conflict because, and they stated this very much in the report, well, we can't gang up on them because it'll be rejected. But on the other hand, how do you get them to do what you want them to do, in some senses? And so one element, of course, if you go to the next slide, is to dramatically increase the reward process. They actually gave very, very large amounts of money and give it to the best performing African countries that are consistent with the conditionality of structural adjustment and neoliberalism. So they set up what is known as a Dean's List to actually then send signals to Africa that this is what they have to follow. On the other hand, they also were able to get a huge increase in the amount of money under their centralized control by setting up a new Office of African Affairs. And then because of a mix-up of the ADI-6, where the United States wanted to go to 4 years instead of the normal 3 years, money had already been done based on a budgeting for 3 years for other countries. Said, hey, well, we'll give you the 4 years and give us all the money was supposed to go to the 3-year plan. And so as a result of that, what ended up happening was they were able to increase the allocation and get a hold of an additional $1.1 billion to begin to implement structural adjustment. Go ahead, next. And so the other way they began to work on, and this is what I've done a lot of research on most recently, is the issue of technical capacity. And so one of the things which was absolutely central is how do you begin to train the entire economics profession in Africa within the government and in the universities and educational systems to, in fact, buy in. So you solve this problem of the inherent conflict of ownership, which by saying, okay, what we do is have to get them to get some sense of the identity by becoming a part of the broader community of neoclassical economists. And that, of course, would enhance not only referent power, but in fact come up with a common set of constructs, which would allow them to comprehend and they themselves begin to approach and buy into the nature of structural adjustment. And that's exactly what happened, basically. And partly it was done through, as I've done in a paper in Economy and Society that came out last January, systematically done through the creation of a huge crisis in the universities. And that was an opportunity to retrain the economics departments throughout Africa in a neoclassical vision. Next. And so also there was systematically in all of this was in fact technical assistance as part of conditionality to train and to build internal constituents for neoliberalism within key departments, particularly the finance ministries, the central banks, and elsewhere, some of the trade departments, begin to see things entirely in neoliberal terms. There was also an attempt through all sorts of mechanisms to provide research support for neoclassical economics. And what was crucial was if they go back to the African Capacity Building Initiative in 1991, next slide, what you have is you have a situation in which they looked upon the transferring nature of the centrality of building up capacity. And you'd think in an African country in 91, you'd say, what do they need most? Well, they need engineers, they need scientists, they need doctors. No, instead was focused on the main capacity issue right now that's extended is economic policy analysis and development management. And so they put a huge amount of effort into that with the various institutes to begin to think about transforming the economics departments throughout the universities in Africa. Next. And one of the things they hailed was in fact something which I've again written on in great depth in my paper, was the development of this African Economic Research Consortium financed by the World Bank, IDRC, Ford Foundation, Rocker Foundation, to build up and to completely retrain the graduate programs and the faculty throughout university. And it was enormously successful. They spent tens of millions of dollars of this project. I happen to know these people that were involved with it. They were colleagues of mine at one time in the 80s when I was teaching at University of Dar es Salaam. They were neoclassical trained. One, for example, Ben Ndulu was the economist who came from Northwestern, picked me up at the airport when I arrived as a grad student in the 80s. So I knew all these people, and they were involved with setting up this incredibly important organization to completely retrain and refocus economics in the neoclassical image throughout African countries. I won't go through much detail. Last slide here. I know we're running out of time. So let me say one thing and then we'll conclude. Can we do that, Faruk, for a minute? Very quickly then, some people argue, oh, adjustment to really in Africa. It's absolute nonsense. There were 37 sub-Saharan African countries out of 45 that actually took the adjustment loan. 33 had 2 or more loans. And what do they have to show for it? As I've spent a lot of time over the years arguing, not much except larger debt levels and declining standards of living over time. And it was a disaster, but there was this long history of innovations to try to come up with without actually blaming the problem itself. Go ahead, Isabel, take a minute or two just to conclude. Sorry, I went too long.
You can turn on your micro.
Isabel, you gotta unmute.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So just a couple of big picture points on China. First of all, it's important to acknowledge that marketization in China was initiated domestically. Secondly, it's important to see that China's market reforms started after a big push industrialization attempt had failed that was meant to bring in foreign technology financed by oil exports. And that big push industrialization was basically stopped because of the dangers of foreign indebtedness. So in this context, China then tried to find a new path for development, which clearly should not involve substantial foreign indebtedness. China did apply for World Bank IDA loans early on, but in this context, they were primarily after the World Bank's economic expertise rather than really substantially the loans. So this creates a very different situation compared to the African context. The bank did play an important role in restructuring the Chinese economic profession in a neoclassical or American mainstream fashion. It also did play a role in organizing exchanges, However, here market socialism and market socialist neoclassical economics in the early years was more important than in the context that we have just heard. As I show in how China escaped shock therapy, there were basically two parallel developments in the 80s, the reinstatement of the economics discipline, which eventually led to the recommendation of big package reforms that resembled key elements of shock therapy, and secondly, an experimentalist approach that ultimately prevailed. So after the 80s, then we have this tension between a completely or very largely mainstream Chinese economics discipline and what I've called a state-constituted market economy in China, which entailed a very different kind of economic expertise. So in conclusion, the neoliberal shift in the World Bank was underpinned by neoclassical economics. Both in Africa and China, the economics profession was remodeled based on the American mainstream and with the involvement of the bank, but to very different effects. In Africa, the economic dependency enabled the imposition of structural adjustment programs. Together with the revolution in economics, this left most countries without an alternative economic expertise, even when the neoliberal policy paradigm was in crisis and some policy space opened. In China, in contrast, economic sovereignty enabled the escape from shock therapy and the emergence of the policy paradigm of a state-constituted market economy that preserved alternative economic expertise within China's large, highly professional bureaucracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Isabella. Thank you, Howard. So we have now about 14 minutes, 15 minutes for some questions. Wolfram?
Yeah, I have two questions. One to Gaëlle. You are saying that the South-South cooperation reproduced the patterns of traditional North-South cooperation. Could you elaborate on that? Because I see a strict difference between Southeast Asian Chinese banks, in particular, like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and the BRICS Bank or the China Development Bank, etc. They do not have in their policies conditionalities or political interventions. Often, I got the feeling we're seeing some projects financed by China in Africa that went astray. Perhaps they were a bit too liberal, too non-interventionist, but I appreciate that, and I see, and that would be my point of view currently, except you, or unless you convince me of the contrary, that they strictly do not have conditionalities to their debts, and also the Chinese and AIIB is not Chinese. I mean, it's Chinese and Chinese majority, but it is an international multilateral bank. In fact, Germany has shares, and England has shares, France has shares, etc. That their credits, their loans are based on state-state agreements and quite transparent. They are discussed in all these forums, Forum Africa, China, Cooperation, blah, blah, and even located and assigned to the UN. Parts of the New Silk Road initiatives are indeed located and administered in the UN, and huge research accompanying that. That was my first question. But I come up later with the second one.
Should I answer now, or Faruk, or you want to?
Up to you. You can, okay. In a short way, please.
Yes. Thank you for your questions. What I was saying is that South-South cooperation tend to reproduce the same system as North-South cooperation, but not all the characteristics are reproduced. For example, you were talking about the conditionality in the North-South traditional system. There are strong conditionalities imposed. When in South-South cooperation, there are really weak conditionalities. Conditionalities, yes. What I was saying is, for example, about the symmetry among members. For example, in South-South cooperation, they tend to say that every member are equals and on the same levels. And I think this is theoretical, because in the reality, this is not what we see. For example, with the Chinese road, I think that we see that the Chinese are having like the same asymmetrical scheme that was like the North-South scheme with the Chinese and Africa is reproduced with it's still asymmetrical, I think, not as what they say in their text and in what it is not what they're doing is not what they are saying, I think.
Yeah, but do you know the surveys that, for instance, McKinsey did in 35 African countries, asking people, how do you see the Chinese in Africa? And you have huge favorable majorities usually in nearly all of the countries, because they say, among others, that they are on an equal footing. They speak to each other on an equal footing. I was most impressed to read that 2018, I think, McKinsey thing. McKinsey is not suspicious of being in favor of China, of course, but they report that.
Okay, so I will read it.
I have to look at that. Yeah. Okay.
Thanks.
Other questions? Jairo?
Can I maybe dive in on this whole question of China and Africa?
Yeah, why not?
Because all right, very quickly, and just kind of pick up a bit on Wolfram's point here. Is I think one has to go through multiple levels of understanding of the nature of these loans, and they're also not so uniform. And it becomes important to actually, and perhaps perhaps Gaëlle and also Ricardo can talk about this. It's the issue of its relationship to the dynamics of the structural interaction between China and Africa and the overall impact it has on the structures of African economies. And that really needs to be analyzed beyond even the issue of conditionality, because in essence, in some cases, for example, some of the collateralization of the loans actually come as a result of long-term inflows of resources into China, or the finance that's associated with the resources. And if you look at the trade structures between China and Africa, very much looks like the global relationship: heavy importation, manufacturing, heavy export to China of resources. And it'd be very interesting. And yes, obviously there's been great movements to some extent in infrastructure, but it's a very complex array. And perhaps both of you could talk about the impact the loans have had on the structural nature of the African economies with China. And so the issue of conditionality, you got to remember that conditionality is not only, historically, conditionality is not only the kind of World Bank neoliberal nonsense conditionality. Conditionalities of loans used to also be tying loans in the old days to specific importation of goods from countries giving the loans. And that's another form of conditionality. So in essence, you're conditionalizing it on the importation. So it ends up having an impact back on the economy that in fact is then providing the aid. And so perhaps we could open it up a bit to discuss this issue of structures, loans, and aid. Sorry.
Thank you. Jairo would like to say something?
Yes, I have a question. I have a question to Ricardo. In Latin America, there have been a long discussion going on if China is still a socialist country. A lot of people claim that this is a state capitalist country. And when you see the advance of China in Latin America, for example, in Colombia, they are now the second partner in export and imports to Colombia. And people also talk about the new kind of global empire reproducing the same pattern of we export raw materials, oil, whatever, and they give you the manufactured goods. So what do you think of this kind of discussion? Because we keep discussing about models of development in our countries, and it's very important to have a clear opinion, especially from a Chinese scholar about this topic.
Thank you.
May I, if so?
Yeah, of course.
No one else, yeah. I think we may have a tacit presumption in mind that would be that China, which would be completely wrong and misleading, that China could save African or Latin American countries, that any country could save another one. That is the classical imperialist colonialist way of thinking. This is not the case. I mean, if an African country or Latin American country doesn't have a conception or a plan or a structural vision for itself and applies for AIIB or BRICS Bank loans, and the planning is weak, and the project goes bankrupt. I mean, the loan giver can of course not save the situation. We have huge restructuring of loans, of course, under COVID. Since last year, billions and billions have been restructured and even dropped by China and Chinese banks. But look, my question is to Ricardo also in that respect. I see a lot of a change in the character of to Howard also and to Isabella. A lot of change recently in the structure of foreign direct investment of China away from resources to industrialization. So some people at McKinsey, for instance, or the Boston Group, I don't know, I regularly read every second week the newsletters and the studies of the Boston University Global Development Policy Initiative or so. And they are saying a huge change taking place into industrialization of Africa and into infrastructures close to industrialization. But on the other hand, and that would be my another question, and then I stop, to Ricardo particularly, you say that there could be a future financial crisis. I mean, if the debt of African countries have a real investment, on the other hand, I would doubt that that would be a cause of a future financial crisis. But look, China is doing that zero COVID strategy, and the West does not follow a zero COVID strategy because it just cannot do that. Well, how do you all, I mean, all you Chinese experts, Howard and Isabella and Ricardo, and Gaëlle and all of you, see the future of the global value chains. Look, if China continues doing that and keeping the debt at zero, the US has, I think, 800,000 deaths toll now. We run from one wave into the other. One day we will have herd immunity, perhaps in 5 or 6 or 7 years or so. Till then, what will the global value added chains be? I mean, do we have an increasingly split world into two blocks, one that follows a zero COVID, Southeast Asia, more or less, and the West, who cannot and does not want. Look, people like German capitalists cannot travel into China now. She doesn't even travel to the Glasgow COP conference, etc., etc. How would that look like in the near future? How long can world value added chains stand that? I mean, they have the Eurasian train that is contactless, of course. And so thousands of containers go back and forth every week from China to Rotterdam and to Duisburg and to Hamburg, etc. But that is only a part of the thing. If the value-added chains are broken, and we have two different basic strategies towards COVID, how long would you think the world could stand that? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, maybe we can take a last question from David Mitch.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, my question is for the China-Africa comparison paper and this issue of exposing policymakers in both groups to sort of Western neoclassical, neoliberal ideas. Could you comment on how you would see Latin America fitting in with that and the Chicago Boy effort and so on to sort of expose Latin American policymakers? I mean, the obvious interpretation would be simply Latin America is basically following the African thing in terms of lacking in economic political sovereignty, but I'm just wondering how you would interpret the Chicago Boy effort and so on in Latin America in that regard, in comparison to what was going on in China and Africa.
Okay, thank you, David. So we have just 4 minutes, maybe one or two answers or reflections, very short. I would like to.
Well, I would like to.
Yeah.
I would like to respond to Harv's questions about China's, for example, the COVID-19 and policy and the two systems between the West now and China, and as well as the capital structure and things. I think China, to my study, from the historical point of view, after the economic reform by Chinese government, it is quite, the Chinese government take a quite dynamic approach. It will not have a fixed plan for a long period of time. Whenever the international relationship and the environmental issues change from time to time, the Chinese government try to be flexible and then to adjust its policy with the African government countries, as well as with the international society. But this is really creating some of the conflicts now, what I say, with the West, especially Western Europe and North America, because the well-developed countries after World War II especially, they already have a quite consistent and workable plans for a long period of time. Now, China would like to have some different approaches from time to time according to their economic reform period and different stage, so that they will adjust their policy from time to time from a very dynamic approach. This may create a lot of the so-called inconsistency or suspected conflicts with the Western society. So that this is my quick response first. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have 1 minute. Someone would like to add something else? Gaëlle, you would like to intervene? No?
I have some questions, so I don't know if it's time
Just
or not.
one question, we have 1 minute.
That was a question to Annesha and Satyaki. I was wondering that if India is taking action to make the punishment big enough to stop sexual harassment. And I also had one question for Jairo. Don't you think that part of the solution for peace should be based on like the dissolution of the elite?
Can I very quickly respond to David, like in 15 seconds? More money went for structural adjustment in Latin America, but it was much more uneven, the experience there. And there always was pockets of non-neoclassical economics in Africa. Sometimes things impact influence. I can't get into a discussion of every country. So that's what I'd say. It was much more uniform throughout sub-Saharan Africa, with the exception of South Africa, which is another story.
Yeah, hi, Gaëlle. So thank you for that question. So that is actually pretty contextual and it varies from one institution to another. So in some institutions, there is this ICC, which I mentioned, and that is pretty effective. You have to go through the proper legal procedure, and then there are recordings and everything. But in many others, it's pretty inefficient. It almost doesn't function. So it's a bit vary, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. So we can take some more minutes because Catherine gave me the hand over the process of record. And so we have maybe 5 or 10 more minutes before the Veblen Commons Scholar Award presentation of the FE.
I can respond to Wolfram's question about what's going on with China manufacturing, but again,
go ahead.
You know, I'm like, I don't want to talk so much. I mean, Isabella, did you want to say something? Because I've been dominating the response.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah.
I just want to second what Robert said. I think this is exactly right, that in the Chinese context, we have seen this system-wide redoing of the whole system over the last 4 decades. So in this context, you have a government and state that is basically used to managing change, whereas in the European and American context, you have much more solidified systems, which I think is really an important point in thinking through these major global shifts. Of course, the dual circulation strategy is important here, and I think the main message of that is that China wants to minimize the vulnerability towards global uncertainties and major shocks that seem to be in the card, while at the same time not withdrawing from the global economy, right? How this then exactly plays out in relation to Africa and Europe and so on, I think is pretty much a moving target. But one thing that I think we need to keep in mind when we talk about value chains, and this is something that I've been arguing for a while now, also in relation to the so-called decoupling debate, is that value chains are very sticky. It just takes a lot of time to build large-scale manufacturing sites. So if we are talking about a pandemic time horizon of 2-3 years, then this is not exactly the time horizon within which you will be restructuring very major physical infrastructure that even under the best of times takes 2-3 years to build. Now, build that kind of stuff in the middle of a pandemic, with all the bottlenecks that we are facing, with all the erratic weather events that we have been observing and so on, you probably want to kind of double that time. So in that sense, I think there's a lot of stickiness in these kind of processes.
Thank you, Isabella. Well, other suggestions?
Well, I can respond to what's going on with the manufacturing to some extent in Africa and China. I think it's very rudimentary at this point, and it's very country specific. The place where China is showing up the most is in Ethiopia right now. You know, and I've been able to get to Ethiopia a few times within a couple of years. Before, I mean, this COVID thing has kind of kept me at home, and so I haven't been to Africa in 2 years, which is like the longest, and I don't know how long that I haven't been in Africa. But my trips to Ethiopia actually, and one of the occasions, I think 2018, I went to the Eastern Zone, which is run by the Chinese, and it is quite remarkable how the Chinese are actually in some cases trying to reproduce, in some cases, entire industries in Ethiopia. In particular, I did some interviewing of a pharmaceutical company from China that was setting up, was really quite advanced. And I asked them, what are you trying to do? Why are you here? And they said, because there's much less competition. We can't really survive in China, but there's a huge market which has a potential here within Ethiopia and providing very good conditions. And we're in a zone run by Chinese, and we're comfortable here. Also, Complete Industries is another industry that completely reproduced itself, which was a leather industry producing shoes and producing purses and things, completely got up and left and created its own zone in Ethiopia. So some of this is happening, but then you go over to Nigeria and there's a lot less of that, for example. So we did some interviewing in one of the 2 zones that were set up with the Chinese, and there really wasn't a lot of manufacturing going on. The Chinese really hadn't been there. There was some games going on. They kicked some of the Chinese out pretending they were manufacturing, but in fact, just importing finished goods and trying to sell it on the local market. So what I'd say basically is it's very rudimentary at this point. It's hit and miss, and it's a thing to begin to watch at this juncture. But the vast majority of the loans are infrastructure focused, and that can have a very important spillover effect into industrialization. Depends really, it's associated with the nature of that particular infrastructure project is. So the jury's still out. There's some interesting developments going on, Wolfram. They need to be really analyzed on the ground to see what's actually occurring here. And it's also the question of whether whether COVID is going to push towards more localized supply chains. Are they beginning to kind of see Africa as a place in which you have supply chains for the African market? And that's a really interesting potential development here, to watch and see. And that could be a spinoff of the impact of COVID, but we'll see what occurs here.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thank you. Well, is there any?
May I mention
yeah.
two little things. First, you cannot imagine how fast the change was with the Eurasian train, the new Silk Road thing. Suddenly it was there. It was suddenly the first one occurred 3, 4, 5 years ago in Duisburg, which is a large interior, a major river hub, and next stop is then Rotterdam, and they have a deviation to Hamburg now. So if you look at the figures, you cannot imagine how it started with one train a month. Now the same train comes every second hour. If you look at the statistic, that's unbelievable. So that means, in a word, as an indication of sometimes change can be very quickly. The other thing that I want just to contribute my own impression from China. I was invited to teach in China, and I was invited from the second year on teaching. Was invited as a heterodoxa, as an institutionalist, evolutionary economist. And second year, they invited me to bring in 4 other Western professors, which I did, largely from ERP ranks and AC and FE ranks and EP ranks. And I did that 3-4 times. And it turned out, after the second year, it turned out that we brought together, that we could bring, we, the Westerners, as a Cal factor, so to speak, bring together 2 schools that had never had any relations with each other at the same university. The classical division between the School of Economics, which was mainstream, all taught and educated in the US, and the classical School of Marxism, both 90 professors or so. And they got together from the third year on and for the first time talked to each other. And we had these pluralist summer schools for PhD students. And so we were the enzyme, so to speak. Interesting, and that came from the top. Then you have to talk together, which meant, my impression was, in the beginning, the School of Marxism, they had the authority but had not really much to say to concrete things, because they were in their own soup, and the neoclassicists were in their own soup. And from in the era Xi, the requirements from top were completely different. Talk with each other, make suggestions that are workable, educate people neither in pure neoclassicism nor in pure old-fashioned Marxism. That was an exciting experience of myself, just to let you know about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Wolfram. Well, Isabella, you would like to add something?
I mean, it's such a big field. I think I just leave it at this for today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, maybe we can end up this amazing session. Thank you very much, Everyone, now we have the Veblen Commons Scholar Award presentation of FE. So you are kindly invited, warmly invited to attend to this session. Thank you very much and have a nice afternoon, night.
Thank you very much for being a
Thank
great
you.
chair as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
everybody.
Bye-bye.